and welcome to part 2 of the beginning of the end. I don't have a little intro video for this one because I'm gonna talk about myself a whole bunch in this while we talk about terrestrial ecosystems. This is a picture I took in one of my favorite terrestrial ecosystems in Sequoia National Park. This is Mineral King in Sequoia National Park, and this is a team of citizen scientists that I led around for an ecotourism trip in the Sierras, and I was supposed to do again this summer, but COVID made that not happen. Anyway, it's I think one of the most beautiful places on Earth. Okay, so for this lecture, what I want you to be able to recall and understand for the exam is be able to recognize some of the characteristics of each of the 8 different types of ecosystems that we're going to talk about today, /biomes. Be able to recall at least these 5 points for each one, for each of the 8. And then also, if I present you with a description of an ecosystem /biome, I would like you to be able to identify which one it is. So, let's talk about them. So, biomes, the use of biomes for classification, is an approach for combining the broad-scale distribution of plants and associated animals into a single classification system. And the 8 that we're going to talk about today are classified according to the predominant plant types that occur there. Like we talked about with succession in the 2 lectures ago, plants are most commonly used for classifying different communities or biomes or ecosystems because they don't move as adults, and so they're easier to use for classification. So we're going to talk about tropical forests. Here's a global map of where some of these regions occur. And then these are actually broken down into more categories than we're going to talk about today, so we're just going to classify them into 8 general categories. So this map has a few more categories than that. But it just shows the global distribution of them. And we'll talk about global patterns in a couple lectures. Oh, and there are 3 general plant life forms that are used in classifying these different biomes, which we will talk about now. There are 3 general plant life forms that are used to classify terrestrial ecosystems. One of them is grasses. This is either big blue stem or little blue stem because it's one of my favorite grasses. Grasses have less carbon in their stems, so they can allocate biomass to photosynthetic greening leaves. There's also shrubs. This is my favorite shrub. This is manzanita. It's native to California. Bumblebees really like the blossoms, and the blossoms actually taste good. You can eat them. The bark is like this really beautiful red color, although it peels every season. And when it peels, it turns this really cool yellow color before it then turns bright red again. It's really neat. I love it. And shrubs will allocate more resources to stems, but not as much to leaves. So the leaves are smaller on here. There's a lot of stem underneath all of these leaves. And the woody tissue gives height and access to light. And then you have trees. This is one of my favorite trees, which you've heard me talk about before. This is a bristlecone pine in the bristlecone pine forest in Inyo National Forest. I don't know how old that tree is, but some bristlecone pines can be like 5,000 years old. In environments that don't promote photosynthesis, trees are going to be shorter and have less density, and we'll talk about some of those environments in a second, until basically you can have ecosystems where trees will not exist. Bristlecone pines are one of the few trees that can live in this deserted area because it's not really Well, actually, it's an environment that does promote photosynthesis in terms of light availability, but not in terms of water availability. So you need water, right, for photosynthesis. That might be an environment that's water limited, may not be capable of supporting lots of photosynthesis. Other regions may be regions that don't have sunlight all the times of the year, or only have sunlight during certain periods, and we will talk about those in a little bit. So let's talk about tropical forests. These are some really nice maps that are in your textbook of each of the different types of ecosystems that we're going to talk about today. And these are just some of the tropical forests that they've pointed out here so that you can see the temperature in Celsius ranges from across the entire year. Tropical forests are mostly restricted to the latitudes 10 north to 10 south. So you can see here, they're restricted around here, around the equator. The temperatures are warm throughout the year, which you can also see in these graphs. And then the blue line is rainfall. So that's millimeters. And then the red lines are temperature. And then this up here is the elevation that they each occur at. So rainfall occurs almost daily in tropical forests. The mean temperature of all the months usually exceeds 18 degrees Celsius, which is pretty warm. The minimum monthly precipitation is almost always above 60 millimeters, which is a lot of water. They only cover about 6% of the Earth's surface, but they comprise more than 50% of all known plant and animal species. So, Brazilian rainforest right in there, really, really important for global ecosystem health. And also, nearly 90% of all non-human primate species live in tropical forests. This picture here was taken in a tropical forest in Costa Rica, right there, when I was there for a field course in graduate school. And every single day when we were there, it would rain at the same time almost every single day, almost exactly like clockwork. And that's what it does in tropical forests. Within tropical forests, this is where you see really distinct stratification of forest layers, like three-dimensionally. So you have the emergent trees in the emergent canopy. You have the upper canopy, which are different trees at different heights below the upper canopy. And then you have the lower canopy, the shrub understory, and then you have a ground layer of herbs and ferns. So most of the stuff down here is shade adapted. All this stuff at the top has high photosynthetic abilities. You also see, because of the temperature in tropical forests, the rates of decomposition are very, very high, which means that the forest floors are relatively thin and have very little leaf litter because nutrients are constantly being recycled because of high primary production. What that means, though, is that the soil is thinner, and so it's less supportive of the tall trees that grow in it. And so what you get is the evolution of trees with buttress-like trunks. This is a strangler fig tree that kind of wraps itself around other trees, and it uses this buttress system to help to give it, and then you can see some here. It uses this buttress system to give it support in a very shallow soil. They occur around the equatorial zone and then outward from there. And they move from like broadleaf evergreen forests, like closest to the equator, to drier tropical forest where it doesn't rain quite every day. And then these are heavily influenced by the intertropical convergence zone, which you should remember when we talked about climate. So I would think buttress trees are really, really cool. Let's move on to our second ecosystem, tropical savanna. Here again is another map of tropical savannas globally. These are characterized by a ground cover of grasses, as in these pictures, with scattered shrubs and trees. They have open grasslands to woodlands, so you can see a few trees. The moisture in these environments is going to control the density of woody vegetation, and they're associated with a warm continental climate with a distinct seasonality in precipitation and large interannual variation in precipitation. So in those last graphs we saw that the temperature and the rainfall lines were pretty stable. You don't see that in these tropical savannas, and that's kind of what dictates them being savannas, is the irregularity in water availability. The mean monthly temperatures usually don't fall below 18 degrees Celsius, but it can get colder in the winter months when you're at higher altitude sites. The seasonality occurs at the end of the wet season, when you see a change in some of the vegetation. And the vegetation cover is determined a lot more by the seasonality of the water availability via precipitation than by the temperature that is occurring there. And a lot of them occur on flat surfaces that have high wind with very little physical structures in relief from the high wind, so the plants are also adapted to high wind conditions. One thing I forgot to say at the beginning of this lecture is that for those 5 points I covered at the beginning, I'm expecting you to do a little research on your own as well. So in a scenario where I ask you to name some common plants or animals, I might not cover all 5 of the points in this lecture, so I will expect you, when you're working on your study guide, to you might have to come up with some of those on your own and do your own research to prep. But I'll cover most of it. So let's talk about the aminals that live in tropical savannas. The dominant, because of the high wind and because of the unevenness in water availability in tropical savannas, a lot of the vegetation that lives there is fire adapted and has evolved with frequent fires. Grass cover in these areas is always present, but the woody cover is going to be ephemeral and pop up and then disappear. So lots of recolonizations and extinctions that have to do with the seasonality and the precipitation. They don't have much more than a 2-layer vertical structure, so you can have any kind of woody vegetation is the top layer, and then the grass is the bottom layer. So not lots of 3-dimensional structure here. Leaf litter really only decomposes in these areas during the wet season. You don't have a lot of decomposition occurring in the dry season, unless it is woody debris that's consumed by termites. So termites are actually very important decomposers and parts of the nutrient cycling in tropical savannas, because during dry seasons, decomposition of leaf litter mostly stops. So when we talked about the symbionts that termites have in their guts for helping them consume wood, that helps with nutrient cycling in the environment. If you've never seen these, this is termites build these really cool structures that are aligned with the sun, and also with wind patterns on the savannas. I don't know a ton about them, but the structures are really, really cool. They're basically termites are basically savanna engineers. I should talk about that in invert though, because it's cool. When woody trees are present in tropical savannas, they can create nutrient-rich patches within the distinct plant communities that live there. So you can have kind of a heterogeneity in the landscape because of that. And because they are largely dominated by grasses, tropical savannas can support a large assemblage of herbivores. So they'll support ungulates and insects like termites, and then also carnivores that feed on ungulates like lions, and scavengers that eat herbivore remains. I put these in here because there's this meme going around on the internet about how hyenas are basically cats, because this is a hyena that's loafing, and then this is a hyena at the Denver Zoo that's inside of a box. I just thought they were cute. But they're scavengers that are typical of African savannas. So, number 3, let's talk about grasslands. Hey, look, does this grassland look familiar? It should. You spent all semester in it. So again, here's a map. They don't actually have like prairie, I think, because prairie habitat is so patchy throughout these other parts of the US, they don't have them covered. They're really only covering the ones that are like continuous and large here. But within these in grasslands, rainfall is typically between 25 to 80 centimeters, and is not exclusively climatic. This should all sound familiar to you because we have grasslands in Pennsylvania. Many exist through the intervention of fire and human activity. Fire is really important for maintaining grasslands, as we learned in Succession, is that intermediate disturbance hypothesis about how fire helps maintain these intermediate grassland stages of succession. Grasslands are very rare habitats now. They've shrunk from covering 42% of the globe's surface to less than 12% of their original size, which is very, very small. They occur at mid-latitudes and at mid-continental regions. Oh, mid-latitudes across this stripe here and here. Their productivity, again, actually that's not so much with the grasslands because they have interrupted periods, but their productivity is going to be mostly related to the annual precipitation that specific grassland gets based on geography. They'll usually have an ephemeral or herbaceous layer. We actually can see a little bit of this at Winnie Palmer. There's none in this picture, but there are a few like elderberry shrubs that are growing in like patches in the prairie out there. They have a ground layer, which is most of like the wildflowers and the grasses. And then they have something that's really characteristic of grasslands is there's a lot going on underneath the soil. There's highly developed root layers in there. There's 3 main types of grasslands. There is tall grass prairie, which is what we have for the most part at St. Vincent. This is dominated by big blue stem, which you saw out when we were doing our plant quadrats, and tall flowers like this. I think this is a helianthus species, like this sunflower. So big blue stem and tall flowers. Tall grass prairie is between like 1 meter to 3.5 meters tall, which you also saw out there when we were sampling. There's also mixed grass prairie. This is more typical of like the Great Plains prairies. And this is largely needle grass and grama grass, which you don't really see so much around here. And then you have short grass prairie, which is also out here. And that's dominated by sod-forming blue grama and buffalo grass, which has an association with buffaloes, obviously. Let's talk about some of the cuties that live in grasslands. Because they are dominated by grasses, they support a diversity of herbivorous species. So you have a lot of grazing ungulates. One of my favorite grazing ungulates that I was very lucky to see in person while I was moving out to California is a pronghorn antelope. Did you know that there are antelope that are native to the U.S.? This thing lives out in New Mexico. They're like so cool. Maybe some of you knew that, but I didn't really know that. And then I drove through New Mexico when I was moving out there, and I saw some just like walking around. It was nuts. They're so cute too. Look at their weird horns. They live in the U.S. You'd think they'd live like somewhere in Africa, but they don't. They live here. Bison, obviously, as well, are grazing ungulates. You also get burrowing mammals. There's a thick soil layer that is promoted and supports the dense root system that grassland prairies tend to have. And because there's a thick soil layer, you have burrowing mammals like prairie dogs and gophers. You also have harvester ants. That's a harvester ant that live. I think that one's got a seed, that one's got a seed it's carrying around. That also live in grasslands. And grasslands also tend to be under strong selective pressure from grazing, but not from where you might think. Not from like bison, like these cuties, or pronghorn antelopes. Not, you would think it would be that, but it's not. It's mostly from underground invertebrates like nematodes that are exerting the strongest selective pressure on grasslands. Isn't that cool? I didn't know that until I started teaching this class. Now let's talk about deserts. Here's a map again of some deserts, some famous deserts. One I've been to, and then another one over here that I've been to. Man, Barstow's hot. Deserts occupy 25 to 35% of the Earth's landmass. They're largely confined to 15 north and 30 south. So, where they're showing up here. And there are three main climatic factors that shape them. There's dry descending air masses. So very dry, swift winds are important. That's number one. There's rain shadows from coastal mountains. We've talked about rain shadows before. Those are really important for creating the dry habitats where deserts form. And then remoteness from ocean moisture. So if they aren't blocked, if they're coastal, they tend to be blocked by rain shadows by mountains. If they're not coastal, they're just not. You see the effect of continentality, which we also talked about earlier, where they're just, like here would be like continentality. And then in these deserts, that line here, this would be the rain shadow that's caused by the Sierra Nevada. Well, at least up here, it's caused by the Sierra Nevada. There are two broad types, and we're not going to cover them, but there are two different types. There's, and what lives in them tends to be scattered shrubs, lots of ephemeral plants because of the very unpredictable water availability, and then open and very stark topography. And a lot of the plants and animals that live there have evolved to evade or resist drought and are very opportunistic. A lot of them have estivation periods during when water availability is low, so that they can conserve the water that they use. I can't remember which desert this is, but that's me in Egypt in 2006. And we went to the Great Pyramids on that trip too, but I can't find any of my pictures besides this one because somebody else took it. That's it for deserts. We've actually talked a lot about some desert animals. I guess I should have covered some desert animals too. We've talked about that desert adapted beetle darkling beetles. We talked about darkling beetles that point their butts up into the air to collect moisture from the air in the morning dew. We talked about those kangaroo rats that collect and condense moisture in the weird convoluted passages of their nose. We talked about the werewolf mouse that gets most of its water from the other mice and other like predators that it eats, and it howls at the moon. We've talked a lot about those. Some obvious desert plants that I can think of, obviously, are cacti. We've talked a lot about those, so you can use stuff we've already learned about for making your lists for studying for the exam. Now let's talk about shrubland. Again, here's a map of some shrublands. These are not a lot of these tend to be small and restricted. This is a picture I took in some shrubland here. In shrublands, plant communities, this is where the shrub growth form is either dominant in the landscape or co-dominant with another type of plant. What is a shrub? Let's define it. A shrub is a plant with multiple woody persistent stems but no central trunk and a height of like 4 to 8 meters. So manzanita is a perfect example of a shrub. It has lots of multiple woody persistent stems, but it all branches out from there, and it's kind of a short little shrub. Mediterranean ecosystems tend to occur like 30 to 40 latitude. They tend to be dominated by evergreen shrubs, and they also have something called sclerophyllous trees. I will spell that. I realize that now I should have put that word on this slide. SCLEROPHYLLOUS. Sclerophyllous trees. They have hard leaves. They have short internodes, and then they have leaves that are parallel or oblique to the sunlight. And remember, we talked about how leaves can change their angle depending on sunlight availability. Some examples of sclerophyllous trees would be any kind of eucalyptus trees or acacia trees, which we've talked about in this class before. Shrublands, like grasslands, the plants also tend to be adapted to fire and also very low nutrient soils, which is grasslands in comparison have higher nutrient soils. So plants and shrublands are fire adapted and have low nutrient soils. Part of the reason, it's mostly, if you notice, basically almost the entire state of California is like shrubland here, and it's partly why it's all catching on fire is because there haven't been controlled regular burns of these landscapes that are very flammable. And when you don't burn them with enough regularity, then they will catch on fire when you don't want them to, because they are adapted to fire. They tend to have hot, dry summers with at least 1 month of protracted drought. And they have a persistent flow of dry air that is moving out of the system that keeps them dry. They also have cool, moist winters, and 65% of their annual precipitation happens during their winter. So there's a lot of seasonality in the plants and the animals that live in there. And I just mentioned this, but they don't have an understory because they mostly just have shrubs. They can sometimes have trees. There's a few coniferous trees that are growing in here, but it's mostly shrubs. And like I said, they're highly flammable. That's why a lot of California is partly catching on fire because of an unusual drought, but also because we don't control burns often enough of the highly flammable parts of the landscape. Some examples of shrublands are the semi-arid regions in western North America, like where I used to live. It was very hot and dry, and I had to drink a lot of water. The border of the Mediterranean Sea is another place. The border of central Chile is another place. The Cape region of South Africa, and then southwestern and southern Australia are the other examples. And then you also have temperate forests, which should also be familiar to you as well because we live in one. So this map kind of we do have prairie ecosystems in Pennsylvania, but this map kind of generalizes that a little bit. In Europe and China, you tend to get broadleaf deciduous forests, so they have wetter environments and they have a warmer temperature region. There are several deciduous forest types in eastern North America. You can have mixed mesophytic, which is the unglaciated Appalachian Plateau. Yeah, so like right around here. Oh, hey, look. And then you can have beech and maple, northern hardwood, boreal forests, maple basswood, oak chestnut, which is mostly just oak now because chestnut blight wiped out almost all of the American chestnut. The oak chestnut, which is mostly just now oak, is what you predominantly get in the Appalachian Mountains. The maple basswood is what you get up like near the Great Lakes. In the Gulf Coast states, you get magnolia oak, and then like in the Ozarks, in the Ozarks, here, you get oak hickory. Central Appalachia actually has the highest tree diversity of any temperate area. I think the Appalachian Mountains are really cool. We have our own little, we're kind of, so like Pittsburgh here is mostly in beech maple basswood forest type here, but Latrobe and where school is kind of on the border, and around here are the Allegheny Mountains, which have, because they're higher in elevation, have their own distinct communities too, and have a few endemic species to the Allegheny Mountains, which we talked about. One was the, dang it, now I can't remember, was it a salamander? We talked about a few endemic species that occur in the Allegheny Mountains. They're part of a temperate forest ecosystem. Temperate forests also have stratification and dimensionality, three-dimensionality to them. They'll have an upper canopy, a lower canopy, a shrub layer, and a ground layer. So you still have stratification, but not quite as much as you might see in a tropical forest. And then, and that's it for temperate forests. Now let's talk about coniferous forests. In Central Europe, these are mostly dominated by Norway spruce, and in North America, in high elevations, you can get Engelmann spruces and subalpine firs. At mid-elevation, you tend to get Douglas firs. At lower elevation, you get ponderosa pine and lodgepole pine. Ponderosa pine is the one that if you smell the bark, it smells like vanilla if you sniff it up close. And of course, we can't forget about the giant sequoias. This is a coniferous forest that I did field work in, well, I guess it's not really highlighted on here. It is a little bit. I did some field work in coniferous forests in Yosemite National Park. This is one of my field sites from Yosemite National Park, where they have giant sequoias. Mostly giant sequoias are down at Sequoia National Park, and then you can also have them in the redwood forests on the coast of California. Conifer forests are cool. A special kind of conifer forest that we're going to talk about now is the taiga, or the boreal forest. It covers about 11% of Earth's terrestrial surface, so not a lot. And there are three major vegetation zones. There's the forest tundra ecotone, which has stunted spruce, lichens, and moss. I've been to... No, that's not it. So forest tundra, stunted spruce, lichens, and moss. Open lichen woodland, which has lichens and black spruce. And then you have the main boreal forest, which is called closed crown forest here, which is spruce, pine, poplar, and birch. I've been to the closed crown or main boreal forests in Maine, and they honestly feel very much like a fairy tale because of all the lichens and moss that grow in them, along with the spruces and the pines. And then I've done field work up in the lichen woodlands up here in Alaska. Sorry, that was my cat. Hold on, Yeti. Oh, and then this is some lichen woodland, conifer forest that I've done field work up here in Alaska, and then this is some other parts of that. So if you notice here down in this, when we were in the southern part of Alaska, the trees are a lot taller. But then as we started to work our way up into like more forest tundra ecotones in the conifer forests, the trees get a lot shorter because the daylight is shorter and the temperatures are colder, and so the trees are stumpier and they grow much more slowly. Yeah, and you can have up here, you have cold lakes, bogs, rivers, alder thickets. You have a cold climate with strong seasonal variation. And then you can also have permafrost. So permafrost is a perennial frozen subsurface. It can be hundreds of meters deep. And permafrost develops where temperatures remain below 0 degrees Celsius for extended periods of time. And what happens is that the upper layers will thaw in the summer and then refreeze in the winter. And what happens is that it becomes impervious to water, and then the ground above stays kind of soggy and squishy even in low precipitation. So when you walk around in these areas, it's kind of like, it almost feels like you're walking on like a high pile carpet because it's squishy from the permafrost being impervious to water for being frozen. Fires are very common in these areas as well. And then some of the animals that dominate them are caribou, like the skull I showed you in the last lecture, moose, elk, snowshoe hare, or boreal red squirrels, which if you haven't seen, they are so cute. I should have put a picture in here. They have like these cute little red tips to their ears, and they're very chatty and they'll throw things at you. Wolves and lynx and pine martens and owls also occur there. And then you also have probably one of the main herbivores there would be spruce budworm because of all the spruce that live in the taiga/boreal forest. Now let's talk about the tundra, which I've also been to up there, basically actually right where it's pointing. There are two broad types of tundra. There's the kind that has 100% plant cover in wet to moist soil. And then there are also polar deserts that are considered tundra, and they have less than 5% plant cover and completely dry soil. So not a lot of stuff grows in the second type. There are three interacting forces that will generate a tundra. So you have to have a permanently frozen deep layer of permafrost, the overlaying active layer of organic matter and mineral soil that thaws each summer and freezes the following winter. So tundra are also squishy. And then you have vegetation that reduces warming and retards thawing in the summer. And the freezing and thawing of the upper layer on the soil is going to create really unique, weird formations on the surface of the soil. This is a picture I took. A lot of the plants that grow in these tundra areas are going to be really small and mini. There's a bunch of mosquitoes that occur there too. All of these little things in this picture, those are mosquitoes. And there's lots of really low-lying plants that grow in the tundra regions. The Arctic Circle, is not like where we took this picture when we were doing fieldwork up there is not technically tundra yet. It's like boreal forest, taiga. But as you like drive up the Dalton Highway in Alaska, you get into tundra regions. So we drove all the way. Oh dang, there's no boundary on Alaska here. I think we drove all the way up to here to a place called Dead Horse, which the logo for the town is just the head of a horse upside down with X's for eyes. It's like a offshore drilling site, and we collected some bees up there. Graham Merlin's gonna do stuff with the bees I caught up there. Yeah. Here's some animals that live in the tundra. These are some musk ox that we saw on the Dalton Highway as we were driving up there, and they smell bad, like their name suggests, and they also just like have this enormous swarm of mosquitoes that follows them around. Tundras tend to have low species diversity and slow growth. Seeds of plants that grow in the tundra can lay dormant for hundreds of years. Arctic plants are really specialized to growing in these extreme environments. And so they photosynthesize for only 3 months out of the year. If I've talked to you about Bombus polaris, the bee that we were trying to find when we were doing our expedition up there, that's not Bombus polaris. That's another species of bee that I took a video of while we were up there. Bombus polaris and the plants that it pollinates only are out for 3 months of the year. When their flowering plants are out, the leaves are angled to maximize sunlight exposure, like we talked about much earlier on in this semester. 1 month before the end of the growing season, they move all their nutrients, they retranslocate all of their nutrients to their roots and below ground biomass, and then they enter like a very long period of estivation for 9 months until the sun is back out, basically 24/7 again. The root shoot ratio can be from 3:1 to 10:1, so they have really dense root systems that they store most of their nutrition in throughout the year, or most of their nutrients in throughout the year. The animals that occur there, you can have things called white worms, collembolas, which I know Shane likes, flies, crane flies, and possibly the worst flies are black flies, deer flies, and hundreds of mosquitoes. If you watch you will be required to watch the video I uploaded on there to Schoology for you to watch of the New York Times article that covered our research up there. We had to wear head masks whenever we were outside, which was all the time, because if you didn't, you would have mosquitoes in your eyes, in your ears, and in your mouth, and in your nose, and it was gross, but still really fun. You can also have lemmings, and Arctic hare, and caribou, and the muskox that I took a picture of here. And then, obviously, also up there you can have wolves. They're all white and floofy, Arctic foxes, and waterfowl. We saw wolves and Arctic fox up there, but I didn't get any good pictures. This is one of my favorite plant species that doesn't just, this genus doesn't just grow in the Arctic, but we saw a lot of them up there. It was pedicularis, or lousewort, and I think we collected Bombus polaris on this. This is another bee that we caught technically in a tundra ecosystem. This is Bombus cryptarum. It's not Bombus polaris, which is the polar bumblebee, but it's another species that's very cute. That orange stuff on its legs is pollen that it collected from some plants. And we just saw them, we saw like a whole bunch of them just crawling around on the ground, and we thought they were near a nest, but they weren't. So I think they were like licking salt off the ground, which bees will sometimes do. And then they landed on our cheese and started licking our cheese. They were weird bees. We called them cheese bees. And then this is Bombus centralis, which is another bee that lives in like taiga/tundra ecosystems. I took this picture up there. And here's just a picture to show you how dense the mosquitoes are up there during the 3 months that the sun is out. So make sure you watch the interactive video that I linked you to on Schoology. You might expect a few extra credit questions on there about the stuff I did when I was in the Arctic. Yeah. And that's it for terrestrial ecosystems. Stay tuned for the lecture on aquatic ecosystems. Bye-bye.